You haven't seen a lot of coverage of this in the corporate media because they've been a little busy covering a porn star saying she had unprotected sex with the President of the United States. That's pretty damn important. There was another black man murdered. I mean, what else do you call it? In California, his name was Stephon Clark. There have been protests in Sacramento for this murder. There was protests at a Sacramento Kings game. They're a basketball team in the National Basketball Association on Friday. Let me read you just a little bit about this and give you my take. Demonstrations in Sacramento. Sacramento marched for hours Friday through California's capital and called for justice in the contentious police shooting death of Stephon Clark, an unarmed black man. It's like the story writes itself, you know? There's been so many of the same stories. During the second day of protests, activists marched about a mile from the city's Tower Bridge to the steps of State Capitol building. They chanted Black Lives Matter and called out Clark's name. On the march, one of the march leaders told people to hold up their cell phones. Police have said Clark had an object in his hand, but no weapon was found. "It's just a cell phone," the man yelled out. "I don't know how the hell it looks like a gun to anybody else." The shooting began Sunday after 9 p.m. when Sacramento officers responded to a report that a man had broken car windows and was hiding in a backyard. They pursued a man identified as Clark who hopped a fence into his grandmother's property. Officials said 2 officers fired when they thought they saw a weapon. Let me repeat that. Officials said 2 officers fired when they thought they saw a weapon. How many times are we going to have to hear this bullshit? Mayor Darrell Steinberg said the city will wait for the outcome of an investigation. How many times do we have to hear that bullshit? The city will take a close look at police training and protocols, he said, because the way Clark died was, quote, just plain wrong. How many times do we got to hear that bullshit? Quote, "Isn't there a better way for police to handle those type of situations?" he said. "There is a better way. There must be a better way." The crowd Friday stood on the steps outside the Capitol decrying a police force that protesters called racist. They said there was no reason for police to open fire. "Cells up, don't shoot." What they're referring to is Stephon Clark had his cell phone up, not a gun. After spending about a half hour at the Capitol, demonstrators took to the streets, occasionally disrupting traffic downtown and at times confronting police officers. Several people, including one member of the clergy, would get the growing crowd moving again as the protesters eventually went to an area where there were several courthouses. At times, a member of the crowd shouted "murderers" at law enforcement and yelled "F the police." Tensions began rising after demonstrators held a vigil Friday night. Some protesters were seen surrounding a police vehicle and climbed on it. Police blocked the road as protesters continued chanting and shooting at the officers for at least an hour, news footage showed. It's unclear whether there were any arrests. A phone is not a gun. Protesters the day before had marched into City Hall and onto an interstate highway as the mayor called for calm. They also went to an NBA arena and kept many fans from attending the Kings game against the Atlanta Hawks. At City Hall, demonstrators called for the arrest of the 2 officers and demanded to see Police Chief Daniel Hahn as they marched into the building. The protest, which was organized by Black Lives Matter Sacramento, briefly spilled into Interstate 5. Quote, "A phone is not a gun," protesters chanted. Just like I'm tired of reading lies from the federal government about Native American tribes or the effects of their toxic crude oil pipeline on the majority of America and the world, it's hard for me to read this because it's the same old record spinning. The police, with their insanely high testosterone levels, and I want to be clear, yes, I make the disclaimer, we can't condemn the entire police force across the United States. I happen to know 1 or 2 police officers. They're not crazy animals. But the bottom line is, let's call it what it is. I mean, how many times are they going to get off saying this ridiculous, "Oh, well, we saw his hands we saw his hands." we thought he had a gun, so we shot him. I mean, what do black people have to do? And this is from a white person speaking. What do black people in America have to do? Should they duct tape their hands to their chest at all times? Should we just cuff them so there's no chance cops could be confused here? And you know, yesterday I watched a few episodes of Flint Town. It's a new documentary series on Flint. I haven't watched the whole series. It's frankly written from the police's point of view. It's not exclusively focused on the water crisis. It's mostly focused on the very large crime in Flint. And it's very, very, I mean, the bottom line is it's a documentary that is very pro-police, and it's told in a sympathetic light to the police. They're understaffed in Flint, how they're being attacked by the community, how police all over the country are being attacked. I mean, I've only watched 4 episodes, so maybe it will change as it goes. But so far, it's very, very sympathetic to police. And, you know, one of the police officers in the documentary, in the Flint Town documentary, sorry, a little tired, was basically saying, like, listen, if I see your hand going anywhere, I'm shooting. Well, that mentality by that white police officer, by the way, in Flint and in Sacramento that just killed this kid, Stephen Clark, who had a cell phone, not a gun. That mentality that if I see anything that I don't know, if I see his hand go anywhere, I'm shooting. That's because they don't value their lives the same way they value their lives. This cop who said that in Flint Town, this cop that said this in Sacramento, saying, oh, well, we thought he had a gun, that said it in South Carolina with Walter Scott, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis. I mean, I was just in St. Louis last year. I got arrested with my former cameraman. Much love to you, Ty. Still at the Young Turks. Love you anyway. We got arrested. They killed a black guy who didn't have a gun. And literally, the police officer in the chase of that African American is recorded saying, I'm going to kill that motherfucker. You watch. And then he killed him. Thank you, Freddie Gray 2. You have a police officer in St. Louis on tape saying, I'm going to kill that motherfucker. You watch. Then he killed him. The African American did not have a gun. And you want to talk about police brutality, sitting in a jail cell for 17 hours with predominantly African Americans from St. Louis. It's not just a violence problem, it's economic violence too. Because they're talking about in St. Louis. I mean, just about every one of them said, this is the new Selma, St. Louis. But how many times, I mean, obviously, don't expect anything from Donald Trump or President Trump or his administration. But how many times are we just, as a population, white, black, how many times are we just going to say, are we going to allow this to happen where, oh, well, the cops, well, they said they thought he had a gun. They were afraid for their lives. Well, you know what? If they don't have a gun and you're not wearing a body camera, that police officer needs to be arrested. There's occasional mishaps, and then there's an epidemic. I'm sorry, but if police officers, I don't care if you're a white officer or a black officer, if you are that confused, if you are that trigger happy, where if you see an African American just move their hand down, you don't see them holding a gun, but you just see them motioning their hands somewhere below, that you just shoot them multiple times, then you need to be fired and you need to be arrested. Because that's not defending yourself. That is murder. And it's also disgusting, disgusting, that you have a corporate media that literally is covering a porn star. Literally covering a porn star who says she has unprotected sex with the president, who, by the way, I'm sure it's true. But why aren't they on the ground covering Stephon Clark and another murder of a black man? The same way they were in Baltimore for Freddie Gray. Or St. Louis for Michael Brown. See, the police, they're there when, there's all these black protesters and white protesters, going upwards towards the police officers that look like military gonzos with shields. But right now on CNN, nah, we're covering Putin and we're covering a porn star. That's the new formula, Putin and porn. Another black man killed? Another day in America. Another school shooting? What could we do? By the way, did you know that the school shooting last week in Maryland, that the male shooter shot a female student and a male student? Do you know that that female student was just taken off life support? So one person was killed in Maryland. I forget the name of the elementary school. I forget the name of the high school. That girl was killed. She was taken off life support. Haven't seen that anywhere. Does her life not matter? Because Stephon Clark's life obviously doesn't matter. But it's, it does get disheartening reporting this stuff. It does get disheartening talking to you about this stuff, because sometimes, even as a journalist, you feel like there's zero you could do. But thank you, Jen. Great Mills High School. The Great Mills High School shooting in Maryland, where the girl was taken off life support last, I think over the weekend. She was, I think she was 15 years old. But let me tell you something, folks. These protests, and I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I am going to tell you what I think. These shootings are not going to happen, are not going to stop until A, there is continued protest. I'm not talking about for 2 weeks. I'm not talking about for a month. I'm talking about every single day until it ends. The protests for the Vietnam War kept going for years until that war ended. You either care about, if you're white, it's on us as white people as well. Why do you think I cover Flint as much as I do, or I covered East Chicago as much as I do, or I was just in St. Louis when I was still at the Young Turks covering protests for a month? It's because it's not just that they're black, it's because they're poor. Black people and poor people, they don't have lobbyists, they don't have accountants, they don't have lawyers. So when Stephon Clark gets killed, and okay, now the mayor says, well, we'll have to see what happens with the investigation. Let me tell you what that investigation is going to say. I'll end the suspense. The police were within the right. He, moved his hand to his waist. They thought he had a gun. I mean, next thing you know, a black man's going to pull out, a super soaker, or, going to pull out bubbles that you spray bubbles for your kid. And that's going to be confused with a gun. I mean, when does it end? Frankly, the police, there needs to be, you want to talk about mental health problems? They need to send psychologists into police departments across America and reevaluate whether these police officers should have a gun. And there needs to be models and training that go on whether, because the standard can no longer be, well, we thought he was going towards his waist for a gun. That's not an excuse to shoot and murder someone. If you don't see that person with a gun, and by the way, police are trained to shoot quicker and more accurately than a suspect. So why is it that just because you see his hand go towards something, right away you shoot? Again, because they don't care about that person's life. They don't value that person's life, especially black people. Well, why is it that the standard isn't if you actually see him pull out a gun, then you shoot. Because if you're a well-trained police officer, well, you should be a little faster on the shoot and response than a black or white person with a gun, shouldn't you? But the standard has been allowed that police could say whatever the hell they want. They could say, oh, you know, he looked at me the wrong way and I thought I confused his eyes for a gun. I confused I accused his frown or his frown with a gun. And you know what? I get a lot of crap from this. I get a lot of Blue Lives Matter people saying, Jordan, you don't understand what police go through. Well, you know what? I might not understand everything police go through, but I promise you, you don't understand what black people go through. I don't understand what black people go through. No white person understands what a black person goes through because you're not black. I could drive wherever the hell I want if I have a car. I could generally walk wherever I want. It's not the same for black people. I happen to know that because I've interviewed, at this point, hundreds of African Americans. But as a human being, if, you know, when a police officer, like they're saying in Sacramento, say, well, you know, we thought he had a gun, blah, 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 blah. Well, why did you think he had a gun? Because he was moving his hands towards his waist? Why does that automatically mean he's about to pull out a gun? Essentially, the police department is training its officers because the sheriffs and the commissioners, they don't give a damn about poor black people or poor people in general. They're training them, if you even think it, if your brain goes off and you feel threatened at all, shoot to kill. But the police's job is to protect the people first. Before you, yes, of course, you're human beings. They have families. If they truly have a threat against them, they should protect themselves. But your first order of business is to protect the people. So the standard can no longer be, well, I thought he had a gun. No, you got to see someone have a gun, goddammit. And you're trained to react quickly. So if Stephon Clark pulled a gun out of his pocket, you would have been trained to respond quicker than he. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. It's sickening. It's sickening. And just like the necessary protests that need to happen nonstop against these pipelines, and just like the necessary protests that need to happen against oligarchy and corrupt state officials that are blocking minimum wage raises across the country, or now moving minimum wage back. And just like the protests that need to happen against gun terrorism, like we saw on Saturday, I think what happened Saturday is great and amazing. I couldn't march or cover it because I just had back surgery. But it can't just be one Saturday. We got to be protesting all over the country. And it needs to be more than protest. You need to go to your city council and hold your local officials responsible and accountable. You need to go to your state capitals and hold your governors accountable. You need to go to corporate media headquarters, your local CBS, your local NBC, your local ABC, your local Fox, and get on them that they're not covering these things. Nothing's going to change if there are not bodies in the street and there is not voices screaming very loudly. Just remember, tonight you will be seeing MSNBC, CNN covering a porn star. Not a black man senselessly murdered like all the other black men senselessly murdered in America.